Today we will start building our to-do application as discussed in the previous video. So I'll go ahead and start digging in right away. Before me, I have my ID. So we have a plain HTML file, index.html, which is where we'll put in our HTML code, and we have a blank CSS file, and we have a blank page because there's nothing there. So I'll go ahead and start adding some content to my HTML file, and I'll start with the title of the page. So I'll say title. Remember, we put the title in the head, my to-do list. And just so you see where that goes, if I refresh now, you see my page has a title if you look at the top left corner here. All right. So with that said, let's go in and put in some information. So what we want to do is we want to list all our tasks. In this video, we are simply going to play with HTML and CSS and put the tasks manually into the page. And well, we're going to try to design it and make it look good, but as we go along, then we improve it and add other things, and later on we read the task from a JavaScript array and things like that. So in this video, let's focus on the HTML part of it. I'll go ahead and start with a bucket. So I'll say div, and I'll give it a class of to-do bucket. So this is going to serve as a container to hold my various to-dos, and then I'll also give it the class content because I'll use this class later on. I'll give it an ID of to-do, and then I'll give it the class content because I'll use this class later on for the CSS as well. And then just below that, I'll go ahead and put the first item. So I'll say div class, and I'll call the class to-do item. I'm giving this a class because I have several of them and I want to design them accordingly. To-do item, and inside the to-do item, I'll put another div. For now, it has no class, and I'll add an h4 tag which will hold the title of the to-do, and I'll give it a class of to-do title, and I'll also give it a class of pending, because initially when we add tasks to our list, when we add a new task, it's going to be in a pending state, which means we have to execute it at some time in the future. I'll use this class later on in the CSS and give it some styling depending on whether the task is completed, it's cancelled, or it's still to be executed. And I'll say, okay, the first task, I'll just type it in manually, go to the market. Oh, I'll say do my shopping. And I'll put a span below that. And I'll say class, I'll call it block. I'll explain these in a minute. And inside there, I'm just going to put a date, and I'll say date, and I'll give it a date of 18th of July, or let's say 19th, or let me just say the 20th of July 2022. Okay, now let's go back to our page and see what's there. I'll refresh this page. So you see we have an item here, and we have so a shopping item, we have the date for it to be executed. I'm going to add some more stuff into that. I'm just going to add another div below that, below the first div. And so the status, this holds the status of the task. So here, what do I have? I have a task, a to-do item. Inside there, I have nested different parts of what makes up my to-do item. So there is a header. There is a heading for this item, which will contain the title, and then there is this span, and there's another span. Now, there's something I want you to notice here. There's something when we have two kinds of elements in HTML. So you could have a block level element and you could have an inline element. And what block element does is, you see I put this in a heading, right? And immediately the next item flows to the next line because the heading is a block level item, so it breaks the line, and the next item you put on the page will not continue on that same line but will go on the next line. To make this clearer, I'm going to add something here, span, and I'll say test span. Now the heading is a block level element, so like I said, it breaks to the next line. And then if you see the span here, you can see I added a test span and it's flowing right next to the original span that I had. So even if I go inside my code and I do this and I move the span to the next line, I'll still have it appearing on the same line like the date, right? And why is that? The reason is because the span is an inline element and it does not add a break, put it on the page. So now that we have our first to-do listed on the page, as we see, I'll go ahead and paste in a few more. I won't type all of those. So I have pasted 3 more to-dos, and what I want you to notice is that this one, the second one, has a class of completed, so we assume that this is a completed task, and when we complete a task, we're going to add this class to it and design it accordingly. And when we cancel the task, we will add this class as well, and it's going to have a different color. And the last one is a pending task, probably still to be done, same like the first one. And the other thing I want to show you is that the to-do, when the task is completed, so I add a completion date when it's cancelled as well. Well, this should be a cancellation date, but for now, maybe I'll rename that later. And if I go to the page, so this is what we have. You see everything is exactly the same, except, well, in the case where the task is cancelled or completed, the status is cancelled and the date, well, this should be the date it was cancelled there. For the other ones, when it's pending, we don't have this last field, completion date. Okay. One more thing, I want you to see how we can use CSS and tweak things a little. I have added a class here, block. So like I said, a span is an inline level element, but you can always, with CSS, you can turn an inline level element into a block element, and you do the reverse for a block element by turning it into an inline element by using a CSS style, which is the display. So we have our page now. I'll go ahead and start styling them so we see what the CSS would look like. I have a CSS file here. The first thing I want to do is include that CSS file into my page, right? So I go to the header, we include CSS files into the head of our HTML document. So I'm saying that reference this style sheet, and I'll start with the body. So I'll use the body as the selector for these first styles, and I'll give it a margin. Okay, no, I'll leave it empty, and then you see what that does. Later on, I'll scroll it down, and now I'll add a header for my to-dos, right? So I'll go ahead and type in a header. So just below my body tag, I will div, I'll give it an ID of header, and I'll say it's header, and I'll say the content is my to-dos. Refresh that. And okay, we just have a plain ugly looking header there. So now what do I want to do? I want to go into my CSS file and I start styling. So the first thing is, you remember my header is a div and it has an ID of header. So what do? I say div, which is the first selector, the base selector, and then I say hash to say I want to reference a div with the ID header, and I put my stars inside there. So I'll just say background. I'll say background. I'll give it a background color of let's see, some, well, background color of that, some shade of blue, orange. No, I don't want that. I want to give it some shade of blue. Well, that's too dark. Okay, I can work with that. And then I'll refresh the page so you see what happens. Now you see my header, right? It's out there. Notice there's some border around these, the top and the bottom. So what I want to do, that's actually the body. So all of this is within the body, and the body applies some default margins and paddings. And what I want to do is, I want to say the margin of the body is 0. Now in CSS you can specify units in pixels, points, and well, you have several measurements you can use to specify units. But when I use 0, I don't specify a unit because 0 of everything is 0, right? So, but normally I'll specify my dimensions most of the time or units most of the time in pixels or percentages. And so I'll give it a border as well of 0. And now if I refresh the page, you see that everything flashes. So now I can go ahead and design things and lay them out accordingly. Okay, but instead of giving my div this plain background, I'm going to add a gradient instead. And just to show you another CSS property you can use, I'm going to give it a gradient. And if I refresh the page, now you see that there is a gradient that flows from a darker color on the left, and going towards the right, it becomes lighter. I'll go ahead and add some more styling to it and then explain what those are. So I'll just paste this in. So I have a padding, which adds some padding to the header. I have a font size, so I'm telling it to make the font a little bolder. So you can see I've made it bigger with this. And then center, so it has aligned the text to the middle, the center here. And I'm giving it, well, we'll look at this height property later on, but you could specify the height in pixels. But I'm just saying 5 viewport height. We'll look at the details of that later on. And what you should note here is also the font style. There are actually a few things happening here. So we have normally family names and we have generic names. And so the first 3 that you see here are family names. And what your browser does is it starts applying the font. So if it cannot understand this font, then it moves on to the next, and then it moves on to the next. And it's advisable to always use a generic family because most browsers will get the generic family. So in the worst case scenario, if you're using the worst browsers possible, then you always have something to fall back to. So the font family is applied from left to right, as you see. Once it finds something it understands, then it stops there. And then I give it a color that's some shade of gray or white or whatever, and just to make it visible. And that's why you have this here now. Okay, so I am done with my header. The next thing I want to do is my to-do bucket. So I also have some styles here for the to-do bucket. Remember, our to-dos were put inside a bucket, which is this div, and we gave it an ID of to-do bucket. And what we are saying is that we want a padding, so to increase some space, and we want the bucket to fill up the remaining height of the viewport, so the window screen, the height. Like, let it expand. So if I refresh that, you can see now it's completely a white background, so you really don't see anything. And then I'm going to take my to-do items. No, before I go to the items, I want to go ahead and add some style, remember. So I also gave this bucket so you could have a class and a div on the same item and you style them. So maybe I have multiple contents on the page, but only one thing that's called a bucket, and I wanted all the contents to have the same styling, then I'll use this. So I'm using this content class here, which is also, it's a class of my to-do bucket. And I'm giving it some more styling. So you see I'm padding everything to the center. I'm moving it to the center. So what I'm saying is that give it a 50%, well, 0% margin at the top, 25% margin to the right, 0% margin at the bottom, and 25% margin to the left, and I say make the width of it 50. So if you look carefully, you see 25 plus 50 plus 25, 100 covers the full width of the page, and I give it this background. What I want to do next is apply some color to my body as well, so that I can make that distinction. And I'll go ahead and say background. I'll give it some shade of a lighter blue color so that we can see the demarcation. And if I refresh this, so that's the purple. This looks like purple, not blue, but we get the point. So there we have our to-dos listed, but now we want to style these to-dos differently, right? Depending on the state, the status. So I'll go ahead and put in some more styling for those. So I'll take my to-do item. I'll say div. Any div that is a to-do item. Any div that has a class to-do item, I'm going to apply the following styles to it. If I go back to the HTML, you would see that all our to-do items have that class. So go ahead and give it some more styling. And in this case, I just want to add some nicely colored border for the demarcation and a padding at the bottom. So if I refresh this, now you see a line, and then there's a small distance between the status pending and the line at the bottom, which is coming from here. So we say we want the border to be 1 pixel solid, and we give it a hexadecimal color. And we add a padding. So if I take off the padding actually, or let me say if I increase the padding to 15, and I refresh, now you see the line between that gets bigger. So I'll put it back at 5. It looks better. And there we go. Okay, the next thing I want to style is, if you look at my heading, my title, there's a lot of space between my title and my task date and the rest of the information, and I don't like this big gap. It's like they're two separate items. I want to reduce this gap a little. By default, heading tags, which range from H1 to H6, have a certain margin around them, and you can tweak that around with CSS by applying your own custom margin. So I'll go ahead and put some styles as well for my heading. And I have this H4. So I'm saying any heading that's an H4 with the title to do, then give it a bottom margin of just 5 pixels. And you see I reduced that. The first one does not have that, so I think I need to check it. Where's the first one? Where's the first heading? Oh, I see to not to do. That's the problem. Okay, so we have everything nice, but now the last thing I want to add is some color. So I'll copy something that I wrote here earlier, and I'll paste it down here. And what are these? So you remember when I was defining these, I made some classes, right? Completed, cancelled, and pending. And that's what, so I'm saying that when you see a title with a heading, a level 4 heading, well, in this case, I'm not saying level 4, but anything that has this class pending, and then you give it the title, you give the text a blue color. If you see it with a class completed, you give the containing text a green color and a red if it's cancelled. And that's what I'm doing. So if I go ahead and refresh this, now you see, so I added some classes there. If I open up the HTML, you will see cancelled year and cancelled year. And that's how you can play around with CSS. There are a lot of CSS properties you can play with to get things working. The last thing I want to show you is how to change a block level element into an inline element, an inline element to a block level element. I'll take away this text span that I put here earlier. And when we go to the page and I refresh, you'll notice that the status year and the completion date are on the same line. But first of all, they are on the same line because they are contained in spans, right? The elements are span elements, and we said span elements are inline elements. So what I'm doing here is I've given them a class block, and I want to use my CSS to turn them into block level elements so they will not be displayed on the same line anymore. So I'll go ahead and type that in here. I'll say if you see something that has a class block, then override the styles, whatever it is, and make it display as block instead of inline, in case it was an inline element, of course. And if I refresh that, now you see that these moved to the next line. So we have a clean page here. Right now, it does not do anything. I mean, if you really want to manage a to-do list, you would not go ahead filling in HTML every time you have a new task. You don't want to do this, right? You want to put it in if you have a form and then populate it. So in the next video, we will go ahead and read these. We will not create the task yet. What we will do is we will put the task manually into an array, and then we will read from that array and populate these. But before that, we will have to do some basic JavaScript, understand some basic JavaScript concepts. So in the next video, I'll introduce you to those JavaScript concepts that you need to populate this page from a JavaScript array. So make it more dynamic rather than having to do all what we have done so far. But before we go, just one last thing to add. Sometimes we might have several tasks on the page like this, and we want to filter our task based on their state, right? So if it's completed, I want to see just my completed tasks. If it's, I want to see all tasks that were cancelled, or I want to see all tasks that are still to be executed. And how do we do that? Well, I'll go ahead and put this in. And I'm just adding a select item. So this is going to be a drop-down menu, and it's going to look like this. No, that's not where I want it. That's not the way I want it. I'll put it inside my bucket. So it's going to look like this. And every time we select pending, it should display only the pending task. We select completed, cancelled. But like I said, for all of these to happen, we now need to introduce ourselves to JavaScript. So I'll go ahead and show you the basic, introduce you to the basic concepts of JavaScript in the next video. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.